On May 8, 1945, silence fell over Europe in a way that no living European had ever known. The Third Reich, which promised to last 1,000 years, had lasted 12. But here's the question that no one was asking out loud in those days. What do you do with a country of 80 million people when you find out that at least half of its adults participated in one way or another in the Nazi regime? The official response was called Entnazifizierung, Denazification, and its story is the story of one of the most ambitious, most complicated, and ultimately most committed undertakings that the victorious powers of World War II ever attempted. Cologne, Dresden, Hamburg, Berlin. He pronounces those names, and what appears before the eyes of the world in the spring of 1945 are not the cities that existed before the war, but aerial photographs that seem to represent another planet, hectares of calcified rubble, skeletons of facades that stand on their own as if the bricks were ashamed to collapse completely. In Hamburg, the bombings of July and August 1943 had generated a firestorm, a Feuersturm that reached temperatures of 800 degrees Celsius, melted the asphalt of the streets, and killed more than 37,000 people in 4 nights. The families who survived found, when they emerged from the basements, that their neighborhoods had ceased to exist. By 1945, between 1.25% of Germany's urban buildings were seriously damaged or completely destroyed, according to estimates by the Allied military government. Rail networks were operating at a fraction of their pre-war capacity. Communications were fragmentary. The water supply in many cities was spotty or non-existent. In Berlin, the capital conquered inch by the Red Army between April 16th and May 2nd, 1945. It was estimated that there were less than 70,000 tons of food left for a population that before the war exceeded 4 million. On that landscape of ash and plaster dust, the 4 victorious powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and France, were preparing to carry out a task unprecedented in modern history. Not only to occupy a defeated country, but to transform it. What set them apart from all previous occupations was that this time the stated goal was not just to secure borders or collect reparations, it was to extirpate a vision of the world. The ruins helped in a macabre way. When everything you knew has been reduced to rubble, when the regime that promised you glory has brought you only humiliation and destruction, the mind is, somehow, more willing to receive new ideas. Historian Frederick Taylor put it precisely. After Stalingrad in February 1943, many Germans, perhaps most, had begun to emotionally disassociate themselves from Hitler. The illusion of invincible victory had been shattered. What was left was a mixture of fear, inertial obedience, and the kind of exhaustion that doesn't allow you to ask questions about the direction you're taking. That was the human raw material with which the Allies would work. But there was a fundamental problem that no previous conference had fully resolved. What do you do with a state that has ceased to exist as a sovereign entity? Because the unconditional surrender of May 8, 1945, not only put an end to hostilities, legally it dissolved the German government. There was no one to negotiate with, no one to sign laws, no one to run the hospitals, schools, trains, or fire stations. The Allies had not only won the war without quite wanting it, they had become the government of a country of 80 million people whose language most of its new administrators did not speak. The weight of what was coming was hard to overestimate. The conversation about what to do with Germany after the war began long before the war ended. In February 1945, at the Livadia Palace on the outskirts of Yalta, a coastal city in Crimea where the Black Sea seemed especially calm that week for a winter of war, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin met to discuss the world that would follow. Roosevelt arrived visibly ill. He would die just 2 months later on April 12th. Churchill arrived convinced that Germany should be neutralized but not destroyed. Stalin came up with his own equations, different from everyone else's. Stalin had not been in Casablanca in January 1943 when Roosevelt and Churchill had first demanded the unconditional surrender of the Axis. But his logic was familiar to him. There would be no negotiations, no ambiguous armistice like the one in 1918 that the German nationalists might later present as a betrayal. This time, Germany would be defeated without possible equivocation. At Yalta, the foundations of what the occupation would be laid. But the specific details, the exact mechanics of how to transform a totalitarian state into a functioning democracy, would have to be defined elsewhere and at another time. That moment came in July 1945, when delegations from the three victorious powers met at Cäcilienhof Palace in Potsdam, a city outside Berlin that had been the residence of the Hohenzollerns and was within the Soviet occupation zone in July 1945. It was a geographical detail loaded with irony. Western leaders entering to negotiate the future of Germany in territory controlled by Stalin. The Potsdam Conference, which ran from July 17th to August 2nd, 1945, was also the scene of a significant replacement. Churchill, unexpectedly defeated in the British general election on July 26th while the conference was underway, was replaced at the negotiating table by Clement Attlee, the new Labour Prime Minister. Roosevelt was gone. In his place, Harry S. Truman, who had barely been in the presidency for 3 months after the sudden death of his predecessor. It was a dome of new faces negotiating the order of an old world. What Potsdam produced was not a peace treaty in the strict sense. That would not come until German reunification in 1990. But a series of protocols and agreements that historians would summarize under the name of the 4 Ds: denazification, demilitarization, decentralization, and democratization. Some historians add a 5th, decartelization, to refer to the dismantling of the large industrial conglomerates that had financed and armed the regime. Together, those 4 or 5 words represented the most ambitious agenda of social engineering that any group of victorious powers had ever attempted on a modern state. The Potsdam Agreement explicitly stated that all members of the Nazi Party who had been anything more than nominal participants were to be removed from public or semi-public office and from positions of responsibility in major private companies. The Nazi organizations, the SS, the Gestapo, the SD, the SA, the Wehrmacht apparatus, were to be dissolved. All Nazi laws that discriminated on the basis of race, creed, or political opinion were to be abolished. The German judicial system, which for 12 years had operated as an instrument of the regime, would be reorganized from the ground up. Behind all this was an internal conversation that the Allies did not air easily, the debate over the Morgenthau Plan. Henry Morgenthau Jr., Secretary of the Treasury of the United States, had proposed in 1944 and managed to get Roosevelt to provisionally approve at the Quebec Conference in September of that year, a plan to transform Germany into an essentially agrarian country, stripped of all industrial infrastructure. The logic was that if Germany couldn't produce steel, it couldn't make tanks. Heavy industry in the Ruhr and Saarland would be internationalized or dismantled. Germany would become a patchwork of federal peasant states, incapable of ever unleashing an industrial war again. The proposal was leaked to the press, which received it with hostility. The Wall Street Journal called it a Carthaginian plan. American public opinion reacted negatively, and Roosevelt, who died in April 1945 without having established a definitive policy, left the responsibility of deciding to his successor Truman. The result was JCS 1067, the operational instruction of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff to General Eisenhower as commander of the occupation, which incorporated elements of Morgenthau's thinking, including the idea that the Americans came to Germany as commanders, conquerors, not as liberators, and who should not adopt attitudes that could be interpreted as rehabilitation of the regime. This initial climate of harshness had behind it an ideological tension that would define the whole process. The struggle between those who wanted to punish Germany and those who understood that it had to be rebuilt. Between those who saw collective guilt as a necessary moral principle and those who warned that if the country were economically asphyxiated, there would be a risk of exactly reproducing the Versailles scenario that had engendered Hitler. The lesson the Allies wanted to have learned was that of the Treaty of Versailles. In 1919, after the First World War, the victorious powers had bet on economic humiliation. The Central Powers, the bloc headed by the German Empire along with Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire and Bulgaria, they were forced to pay 132,000 million of Marco's gold in reparations, a figure that would be equivalent to approximately $600 billion today. Article 231 of the treaty, known as the War Guilt Clause, stated that Germany accepted full responsibility for all damage suffered by the Allies as a result of the conflict. Germany was impoverished, humiliated, and filled with resentment. That resentment was exactly the breeding ground that allowed Hitler to build his political movement during the 1920s. Appealing to nostalgia for lost greatness, extreme nationalism, genuine grievance of an impoverished nation, and the search for a scapegoat. The hyperinflation of 1923 had wiped out the savings of the middle class. The Great Depression of 1929 had plunged millions into unemployment. On these successive layers of economic trauma, Nazism built its rise. This time, the Allies knew they couldn't just punish an army. They had to uproot an ideology. And for that, they needed, paradoxically, a Germany functional enough to be able to govern itself and prevent communism from filling the vacuum. The first step was to divide Germany into 4 occupation zones. The northwest came under British control, a strip of territory that included the port of Hamburg, the industrial area of the Ruhr, and cities such as Hanover, Düsseldorf, and Cologne. The southwest, under French control, encompassing Baden, Württemberg, and the Rhine-Palatinate, with the Saar as a separate protectorate. The southeast, under American control, which included Bavaria, Hesse, and Württemberg-Baden, with Munich as the central city. The northeast, under Soviet control, comprising Saxony, Thuringia, Brandenburg, and Mecklenburg-Pomerania, with the vast majority of the traditional German agricultural territory. Berlin, the capital, located deep inside the Soviet zone, was jointly administered by the 4 powers through the Allied Kommandatura. The city was in turn divided into 4 sectors: the Soviet Northeast, the British Northwest, the American South, and the French Southwest. This structure would produce decades later the most tense scenario of the Cold War. But in 1945 it was simply the attempt to collaboratively govern a destroyed metropolis. The immediate problem was that each of those 4 powers had come to the table with a radically different vision of what exactly it meant to denazify, and with national interests that in several cases came into direct conflict with the stated goal of transforming Germany. The Americans arrived with the most systematic approach and the greatest moral certainty. Prompted by JCS Directive 1067, they instructed General Lucius D. Clay, appointed in June 1945, Lieutenant General and Eisenhower's deputy at the Allied Forces headquarters, to implement denazification with bureaucratic rigor. Clay, who at 48 was the youngest general in the American Army, came with a reputation for being energetic and organized. He had earned his stripes during the war by administering the American industrial production program in wartime, imposing curfews, energy restrictions, and bans on horse racing. No one expected him to be soft on the Germans. However, the reality of the terrain would gradually corrupt the purity of his instructions. One of the first internal battles of the American occupation was over what to do with the second-rate Nazi. The city official who had processed documents for the expropriation of Jewish property, the teacher who had taught racial biology in elementary school, the doctor who had issued health certificates for selections in the camps. In May and June 1945, during the first weeks of the occupation, the American army arrested 700 people a day in their area. By August 1945, 18,000 people had been arrested. By September, 82,000 were in internment camps in the American zone alone, waiting to be processed. Since 40,000 forms could arrive in a single day at the sorting offices, the system began to collapse under its own weight almost from the beginning. IBM's Hollerith machine, installed in Paris to cross-reference Nazi affiliation data, suffered repeated power outages due to the incompatibility of European electrical systems. The Soviets functioned radically differently. His area was the first to complete the formal expropriation of property from certified Nazis. SMAD Order number 124 of the 30th of October 1945 authorized the requisition of all productive property from Nazi activists, arms manufacturers, war criminals, and party financiers in Saxony. The breadth of the definition was deliberate. Any company that had produced war material, which in the final years of the Reich was almost any company of a certain size, could be nationalized under that category. At the same time, Soviet land reform demolished in a few weeks the structure of land ownership that had existed in East Germany for centuries, expropriating the large Junker estates in the east to distribute them among settlers and landless peasants. It was simultaneous denazification and social revolution, packaged in the same decrees. The Speziallager, special camps that operated in the Soviet zone between 1945 and 1950, are one of the darkest chapters in the entire history of the occupation. In addition to certified Nazis, these camps housed political opponents of all kinds who represented obstacles to the Sovietization of East Germany, social democrats who refused to merge with the communists, former officers with no political affiliation but local influence, businessmen, journalists, priests. The Sachsenhausen camp in Oranienburg, the same complex that had been a Nazi concentration camp between 1936 and 1945, was converted in 1945 into Special Camp No. 7 for Soviet forces. Their conditions were brutal: extreme overcrowding, insufficient food, lack of medical care. It is estimated that between 1945 and 1950, some 42,000 prisoners died in these Soviet camps. For decades, its existence was officially denied. Only with the partial opening of archives from the USSR and the former GDR in the 1990s was it possible to document their scale with some precision. The British inherited the most industrialized area of the country, the Ruhr, with its coal mines and steel mills, and from the beginning their priority was operational rather than ideological. Its denazification machine was less ambitious in its pretensions than the American one, but its practical results were not necessarily worse. Brigadier Hayman, who was in charge of the internal affairs of the British Control Commission, came to the early conclusion that the most efficient way to manage the process was to have the Germans try the Germans. This idea, which at first glance seemed to delegate responsibility in an intelligent way, had an inevitable consequence. The judges who tried former Nazis were often themselves former Nazis, or people whose record during the regime was not impeccable. The French had never been invited to the Yalta or Casablanca conferences. Its inclusion as the fourth occupying power was a result of political negotiation, not military weight. De Gaulle's forces had liberated French territory but had not decided on war. This gave them an important symbolic legitimacy. France was a great colonial power that could not be left out of the reordering of Europe, but also a specific perspective marked by 4 years of German occupation. Their commanders on the Rhine had an embodied memory of what Nazism meant that the Americans who came from another continent could not have in the same way. The French zone was also characterized by the most explicit effort at reculturation. The study of French became compulsory in schools in its area. Displacing English and French teachers and cultural assistants were sent to German educational centers in an effort to shape the cultural identity of the following generations. It was a form of soft imperialism with a certain pedagogical coherence, although its reception among young Germans was mixed. 4 zones, 4 perspectives, 4 agendas. Germany became a laboratory for different methodologies to solve a problem that no country had had to face on that scale. And the competition between these methodologies soon revealed that the one principle they all truly shared was that none of them could afford to appear softer than the others. The first thing everyone agreed on was the most immediate: arrest the most obvious Nazis. In the first months of the occupation, the 4 powers proceeded with what was officially called automatic arrests. Automatic arrests of active members of the Nazi apparatus in positions of power, policemen who had been part of the Gestapo, civil officials who had applied the racial laws, members of the SS, the Schutzstaffel, Hitler's paramilitary elite, at all ranks, military high command officers accused of war crimes, directors of companies that had used slave labor from the concentration camps. Without the need for prior trial, these people were arrested and taken to Allied internment camps. In the period between 1945 and 1950, approximately 400,000 people passed through these camps. Most were run by the Western Allies, but the largest proportion of detainees were concentrated by the Soviets in their area. And here begins one of the first cracks in the process. The Soviets didn't just imprison Nazis. Its Speziallager, special camps, a euphemism that the name itself makes clear, also housed political opponents who had nothing to do with Nazism, but who represented a potential obstacle to Soviet plans in the region. Social democrats, non-communist trade unionists, conservatives with local influence, anyone who might hinder the future political satellization of East Germany. It is estimated that between 1945 and 1950, some 42,000 prisoners died in these Soviet camps from starvation, disease, and extremely overcrowded conditions, although for decades the figure was suppressed and only came to light with the partial opening of Soviet archives in the 1990s. Simultaneously, the Nazi Party was formally banned. Anyone caught propagating his ideas could be sentenced to death. This was, at least in theory, the clearest of all measures. The criminal organization that had ruled Germany for 12 years ceased to exist legally. But dissolving an organization on paper is one thing. Eradicating the ideology that organization had planted in the brains of 2 generations is something else entirely. The Nazis had been, among other things, geniuses of visual design and mass propaganda. His model was conscious and explicit. Joseph Goebbels, the Reichsminister für Volksaufklärung und Propaganda, Minister for People's Enlightenment and Propaganda, had studied the mechanisms of collective persuasion with academic meticulousness before putting them at the service of destruction. Under his leadership, the regime had redecorated Germany with its iconography for 12 years. The swastika on public buildings, on official documents, on the flags that hung on practically every street in every city in the country. They had engraved their stamp on monumental architecture, on the signs of train stations, on the frontispieces of the courts. They had filled the libraries with their books and the cinema screens with their narrative. On the night of May 10, 1933, just 3 months after the seizure of power, Nazi students had burned more than 25,000 books at Berlin's Opernplatz, now renamed Bebelplatz, while Goebbels harangued 40,000 people with the microphone on and the spotlights illuminating the bonfire for the cinema newsreels. The works of Heinrich Heine, Sigmund Freud, Karl Marx, Bertolt Brecht, Erich Kästner and Ernest Hemingway burned that night. The burning was repeated in more than 20 university towns simultaneously, with torchlight parades and ritualized ceremonies that Goebbels had coordinated with propagandistic precision. In all, some 2,500 people, writers, artists, intellectuals, ended up in exile in the years that followed. The Allies inherited that physical landscape and had to dismantle it piece by piece. But they also inherited the conceptual problem that any process of cultural purification implies. Where does the necessary destruction of a criminal ideology end, and where does the censorship that reproduces the methods of the enemy you have just defeated begin? The first step, and one that has endured to this day as the law in force in the Federal Republic of Germany, was the total prohibition of the public use of the swastika. Exhibiting it became a criminal offense. Paragraph 86A of the German Penal Code, in its current form, prohibits the use of symbols of unconstitutional organizations, a category that includes the swastika, the Nazi salute, and the insignia of the SS. The law has explicit exceptions for educational, artistic, scientific, and journalistic uses, a distinction that the post-war editors themselves introduced to prevent the tool of condemnation from becoming a tool of ignorance. US forces took control of the media in their area with surprising comprehensiveness, even revised decades later. 37 German newspapers came under American control, 6 radio stations, 314 theaters, 642 cinemas, 101 magazines, 237 publishers, more than 7,400 booksellers and printing workshops. To manage that infrastructure and make sure that what came out of it corresponded to the Allied vision of the New Germany, the American military created the Information Control Division, which not only suppressed Nazi material, but actively produced and distributed pro-democracy material, reporting on the regime's crimes, news of the Nuremberg Trials, and political analysis aimed at shaping a public opinion that had been consuming exclusively the Nazi version of reality for 12 years. With that infrastructure under its control, the US military did something that its own top brass acknowledged with some discomfort. It drew up lists of books considered an ideological threat and proceeded to confiscate and destroy them. The German list of banned titles, drawn up by the American Military Directorate in collaboration with propaganda experts and cultural representatives, contained thousands of entries. But the destruction was not spectacular. There were no public bonfires. The US Military Directorate explicitly recognized the awkward parallel with the 1933 book burnings and decided that the visibility of the gesture was exactly what had to be avoided. The volumes were quietly shredded in large industrial paper mills. The material result was identical to that of the burning. The book ceased to exist, but the absence of ceremony made it less visible, less criticizable, and, in the view of American planners, less comparable. The irony did not escape anyone who thought about it for 2 minutes. Museums dedicated to glorifying Nazi ideas or soldiers of the Reich's elite units were also liquidated. Their collections were confiscated or destroyed. Artworks extolling the regime's ideals, which reportedly included a considerable number of epic paintings of Hitler posing as a medieval Teutonic knight, or heroic depictions of the Eastern Front, ended up in American military warehouses or were simply disposed of. New art produced in the American zone was also subject to restrictions. The themes, styles, and frames of reference that the regime had actively promoted, heroic neoclassicism, representations of the Aryan race in sculptural form, the aesthetics of the masses in motion, were banned. On the streets, entire teams of Allied soldiers systematically roamed the country. They scraped swastikas etched into the facades of buildings that bore the regime's mark since 1933 or earlier. They took down flags from the facades of town halls and barracks. They removed busts of Hitler from squares, schools, and public offices. They renamed streets, squares, and stations that bore Nazi names. Adolf Hitler Platz became, in many cases, simply Marktplatz or Hauptplatz again. They collected the stamps, forms, and paper headers with imperial eagle and swastika that filled the archives and drawers of the entire public administration. It was a physical, methodical work and, on that scale, absolutely without historical precedent. No previous occupation had addressed the materiality of an ideology defeated with such systematicity, and yet everyone who participated in it knew that they were attacking the symptoms, not the cause. The symbols disappeared. The ideas remained in the brains of those who had used them. The most difficult battle would not be scraping stone, but changing minds. On May 18, 1945, in the small Bavarian town of Nammering, near Passau, US soldiers forced residents of neighboring villages to march to a field where the bodies of several hundred prisoners massacred during one of the regime's last death marches lay. The villagers, people who had lived a few miles from the camps and officially knew nothing, were forced to watch. Some received shovels and had to help give the dead a dignified burial. This scene was not improvised. It was part of a strategy. The Allies had designed a sophisticated psychological warfare operation that went far beyond posters and leaflets. Its central objective was to produce in the German population what the planners called Kollektivschuld, collective guilt, the psychological impossibility of distancing oneself from the crimes of the regime by resorting to ignorance, passivity, or differentiation between Nazism and the ordinary German people. If that distance existed, if the Germans could tell themselves that this had been done by the Nazis, not them, then the moral reform necessary to build a stable democracy was impossible. The intellectual gamble was enormous, and so was the risk. The journalist and writer Hans Haber, who had returned to the country as an American soldier after years in exile and almost immediately became editor of the first German newspaper with an Allied license in Munich, pointed out the dilemma clearly. If the Germans were collectively guilty, if all without exception bore the responsibility for the crimes of the Reich, so in practice no individual had specific guilt, because the guilt shared by everyone is the fault of no one in particular. Eugen Kogon, a political writer and devout Catholic who had spent 6 years in the Buchenwald concentration camp for his active opposition to the regime, expressed the same concern from the victim's perspective. The strategy of collective guilt was producing in many Germans a defensive reaction that favored not genuine reflection but denial and resentment. But the American army in mid-1945 had its own pressures. Surveys of soldiers stationed in Germany showed that a significant proportion of them, in some regiments as many as 60 or 70%, according to testimonies collected, regarded the Germans as a whole as enemies and were not particularly interested in making distinctions. The manual distributed to American soldiers before entry into Germany in the fall of 1944, 48 pages known as the Pocket Guide to Germany, 2 million copies distributed, warned, "Trust no one except your kind. Beware especially of young Germans between 14 and 28 years of age. Since 1933, German youth have been carefully and thoroughly educated for world conquest, murder and treachery." The guidance was explicit. You were in enemy territory. There was no fraternization. It was absolute. Sidney Bernstein, head of the Psychological Warfare Division of the Allied Forces, articulated the goal of the collective guilt campaign with the brutality that the context seemed to justify. The intention was to shock and humiliate the Germans, to prove to them beyond any possible challenge that these crimes against humanity had been committed, and that the German people, not just the Nazis and the SS, bore the responsibility. It was a mandate that implicitly acknowledged something that Allied planners knew and that no official speech could say out loud, that millions of ordinary Germans had been aware of substantial aspects of the regime's crimes, or could have been if they had wanted to look. Posters were the first instrument, the most immediate and the cheapest to produce. The most famous of all, distributed throughout Germany in the summer of 1945, showed 7 photographs of the corpses of victims of the Dachau concentration camp after its liberation by American troops, dominated by a large headline in black on a white background. Diese Schandtaten, Ihre Schuld. These shames, your fault. The text below the images was explicit. In 12 years, Nazi criminals had tortured, deported and murdered millions of Europeans. Men, women and children had been persecuted to death just for being Jews, Czechs, Russians, Poles or French, and the Germans had watched in silence and tolerated it. There were other equally straightforward posters, some with images of Bergen-Belsen corpses taken by army photographers in the days after the camp was liberated in April 1945. Each carried the same structural accusation. It was not only the regime that was responsible, but any German who had known and had not acted. The British writer James Stern, who accompanied the American troops in those months and left a detailed testimony of what he observed, described a scene in a small German town whose name he did not specify in his account. A crowd gathered around a series of photographs that at first seemed to show garbage piled up, formless waste piled up in a field, and that, when looked at, carefully revealed themselves to be human bodies. Each photograph was headlined, "Who is guilty?" Soon after, the posters were replaced by larger, more explicit versions. "This city is guilty. You are guilty." Direct confrontation with the corpses was the next level of the strategy. For communities living near newly liberated concentration camps, the experience was immediate. They were physically led to the enclosures, often in columns organized by American soldiers, who led the mayor of the town and the members of the municipal council. They were shown the barracks, the gas chambers, the crematoria, the mass graves with their superimposed layers of the dead. In some cases, such as in Nammering, they gave them shovels. In others, such as in Nordhausen, where prisoners at Camp Dora had been forced manufacturers of V-2 rockets, the inhabitants of nearby villages were forced to personally exhume corpses from graves and carry them in wheelbarrows to be buried with dignity. The documented reactions were diverse. Some were crying, others were vomiting. Some maintained a neutral expression that the interpreters described inaccurately as disbelief or shock. A few protested, insisting that they had not heard anything. The photographs taken that day show faces that historians have analyzed for decades without reaching a consensus. Genuine guilt, genuine horror, defensive denial, or simply the exhaustion of people who had been surviving for years inside a system that crushed them too. For those who lived farther from the camps, the American army transported the horror directly to the villages. Trucks loaded with corpses were taken to public squares. Screenings of documentary films about the regime's crimes, including the short film Die Todesmühlen, The Mills of Death, released in the American zone in January 1946, and the subsequent Welt im Film No. 5, became mandatory attendance for Wehrmacht soldiers in captivity and for civilians in many cities. Many spectators burst into tears during the screenings. Others came out with their heads down. Some tried to resist entering and had to be persuaded or directly led by soldiers. The German state had believed it possible to industrialize death and keep it out of the field of vision of the majority. The Allies were determined to prove that this was a lie. Life magazine described his 2 weeks of self-defense deposition as arrogant, cunning, and smart. Goering had enjoyed the limelight until the last moment, but Nuremberg was only the tip of the iceberg. Between December 1946 and April 1949, the United States conducted 12 additional trials in the same courthouse. In total, 199 defendants were tried in these supplementary trials, 161 were convicted, and 37 sentenced to death. The defendants included doctors who had experimented on human beings, judges who had perverted the law to serve the regime, industrialists who had used slave labor, SS commanders responsible for the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile extermination squads that operated behind the front lines in the east. It was justice. It was incomplete. And the question that no one could satisfactorily answer was, what was to be done with the other 45 million? On November 20, 1945, at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, the city that had been the scene of the great rallies of the Nazi Party, deliberately chosen so that its name would become synonymous not with the triumph but with the condemnation of the Reich, the most important trial of the 20th century began. The International Military Tribunal tried 24 of the most important Nazi high commanders who had fallen into Allied hands. Presiding over the list are names that in previous years had represented absolute power. Hermann Göring, the Reichsmarshal who had been Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, President of the Reichstag and Hitler's official heir until the final weeks of the war, arrived on the defendant's stand with 4 assistants, a nurse, 2 chauffeurs, and a kitchen crew of 5. He had left behind a train full of stolen art and enough caviar and champagne to last for years. Joachim von Ribbentrop, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, who had signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in 1939. Wilhelm Keitel, head of the High Command of the Armed Forces. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Reinhard Heydrich's successor at the head of the SS and one of the architects of the Holocaust. Karl Dönitz, the admiral whom Hitler named his successor in his political testament. The trial lasted 11 months, until October 1, 1946. On October 1, 1946, the tribunal pronounced its verdicts. 19 of the 21 defendants present were found guilty, 3 were acquitted, 12 received death sentences, 3 were sentenced to life in prison. The rest received sentences of between 10 and 20 years in prison. On October 16, 1946, 10 men were taken to the gymnasium of the Nuremberg prison complex and hanged. Hans Frank, the Governor-General of occupied Poland, where he had overseen the murder of millions. Wilhelm Frick, Minister of the Interior, who had drafted the Nuremberg laws against the Jews. Julius Streicher, the editor of the anti-Semitic weekly Der Stürmer. Alfred Rosenberg, the ideologue of the party. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Fritz Zeukel, the coordinator of slave labor who had dragged millions of people from the occupied territories to serve in German factories, Alfred Jodl, Wilhelm Keitel, and Arthur Seyss-Inquart. Martin Bormann, Hitler's personal secretary, was sentenced to death in absentia. For decades, there was speculation about whether he had escaped. In 1998, a DNA test of his remains, found in Berlin, confirmed that he had died in the final days of the war. Hermann Göring committed suicide the night before his execution, swallowing a cyanide capsule that subsequent investigations could not determine with certainty how he had obtained it in a supposedly guarded cell. What is known is that his last weeks on the stand had been, paradoxically, a spectacle. Life magazine described his 2 weeks of self-defense deposition as arrogant, cunning, and smart. Göring had enjoyed the limelight until the last moment, but Nuremberg was only the tip of the iceberg. Between December 1946 and April 1949, the United States conducted 12 additional trials in the same courthouse. In total, 199 defendants were tried in these supplementary trials, 161 were convicted, and 37 sentenced to death. The defendants included doctors who had experimented on human beings, judges who had perverted the law to serve the regime, industrialists who had used slave labor, SS commanders responsible for the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile extermination squads that operated behind the front lines in the east. It was justice. It was incomplete. And the question that no one could satisfactorily answer was, what was to be done with the other 45 million? When the war ended, about 8.5 million Germans, approximately 10% of the country's total population, were members of the Nazi Party. But the apparatus of support for the regime was much broader. The German Labour Front had 25 million members. The National Socialist People's Assistance Work, the party's welfare organization, numbered 17 million. The National Socialist Women's League exceeded 2 million. In total, adding the party and all the affiliated organizations that constituted the structure of the Nazi state, we are talking about approximately 45 million people. Trying 45 million people in a formal court was mathematically impossible. The Allies needed a system. The system they designed was called, in its most developed version, the National Socialism and Militarism Liberation Act, enacted in the American Zone on March 5, 1946. And its central instrument was the Fragebogen, a questionnaire of 131 questions distributed to all German adults over the age of 18. The questions covered everything: history of political affiliation, positions held, organizations in which one had participated, properties acquired during the regime, trips made, written publications. It was, in theory, an unprecedented social X-ray tool. Between 1945 and 1948, 20 million of these forms were distributed in the 4 occupation zones. In the Americas, the process generated 13.5 million record sheets processed, of which 10.5 million were initially classified as non-imputable cases. The cases that were imputable were transferred to the Spruchkammern, denazification tribunals run not by the Allies but by Germans, composed of personnel who had been vetoed by the occupying forces. 545 of these courts were established in the American Zone, organized at the level of Kreis, the administrative unit equivalent to a county, with a total staff of approximately 22,000 people. It was a vast system, and it had a structural problem that condemned it from its conception. We are in the pre-digital era. The records were physical, incomplete, easily destroyed. In the last days of the regime, huge amounts of Nazi documentation had been incinerated. The party archives, which had been saved in part by the action of an anti-Nazi official who had rescued membership lists from their destruction, ordered in April 1945 as American troops advanced on Munich, offered partial but not comprehensive data. Perjury was rampant. People lied systematically, and in many cases it was impossible to prove it. The courts relied heavily on written statements from friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. And here the deeper problem appeared. In a society where virtually everyone had been involved in the regime in one way or another, where social cohesion depended on not pointing fingers at one's neighbor, The pressure to write favorable statements was enormous. Tens of thousands of Germans with questionable pasts got Persilscheine, literally Persil certificates, named after the popular brand of detergent because they left the reputation of those who obtained them clean, documents that whitewashed their records in exchange for little more than the goodwill of acquaintances. The statistical result is eloquent and devastating. Only 1.4% of the people investigated were classified as Hauptschuldiger, major offender. The vast majority were labeled as simple Mitlaufer, follower, literally someone who simply went with the flow, which in the best case carried a small fine. The machinery that was going to purge Germany of its Nazis, operating in the real world with all its human conditionings, was mass-producing acquittals. The dark joke circulating in the corridors of the occupation was that the Persilscheiners did not clean clothes but crimes. As the process progressed, or more accurately as it got stuck, the differences between the occupation zones became more and more visible. In the American zone, the initial approach was the most aggressive in terms of ideological purification. Anyone who had been an active Nazi was expelled from his government office. The policy was clear on paper. In practice, it created an unsustainable logistical problem. In Nazi Germany, it was virtually impossible to advance in public service without at least appearing enthusiastic about the party. If all those who had shown such enthusiasm were expelled, the administration of southeastern Germany was paralyzed. And the paralysis was not abstract. Without trained officials to manage water systems, civil registries, or food distribution networks, people died. Historian Frederick Taylor documents an illustrative case. In August 1946, an explosion of coal dust trapped hundreds of miners in a mine in Unna, in the British zone. Many of the mine's inspectors had been fired because of their Nazi affiliations. Their replacements, recruited from among retired personnel, no longer had the necessary technical capacity. Rescue teams lacked the key skills. The only underground firefighting expert available was an ex-Nazi who had just been released from a detention center. He had to be taken directly from the prison to the mine to lead the rescue operation. The Unna disaster cost 418 lives and became the worst mining tragedy in German history. It could not be said with certainty that denazification had caused the entire accident, but neither could it be denied that the massive purge of qualified technical personnel had contributed to the magnitude of the disaster. In the British zone, the military commanders adopted a more pragmatic approach from the beginning. The stated policy was to purge all senior officers, but reinstate them if subsequent checks showed that they were acceptable, a diplomatic adjective that the Foreign Office deliberately used throughout its ambiguity. Privately, Brigadier Douglas Hayman, deputy head of the Control Commission's Internal Affairs Division, concluded that the best solution was for the Germans themselves to try their own. In practice, it was a way of transferring responsibility for inevitable failure. In the French zone, the emphasis was still different. France, which had lived through 4 years of humiliating occupation, wanted first and foremost to ensure that the Nazis were eliminated from the civil service and key industries, watching the Americans deal with political purges. But their deepest priority was deindustrialization. They did not want Germany to be able to rebuild the war machine that had crushed Paris in 6 weeks in 1940. Their cultural policies were also particular. The study of French became compulsory in schools in their area, displacing English, and French teachers were sent to German classrooms to ensure that the next generation learned to look to France as a model of civilization. Helmut Schnatz, who was 12 years old in 1946 and attending the gymnasium in Koblenz, would remember decades later the freezing classrooms of that brutal winter. Wood and coal were reserved for the occupants, with the students crammed into their desks in sweaters and coats, while an elegant French assistant, fresh from her first job, she taught classes completely oblivious to the cold that paralyzed her students. And then there was the Soviet zone. The Soviets had the most organized and unified denazification process of the four, but also the most instrumental. In Western sectors, the post-Nazi government was built with people from across the political spectrum. In the Soviet zone, systematic preference was given to members of the KPD, the Communist Party of Germany, which would later merge with the Social Democratic Party under Soviet pressure to create the Unified Socialist Party of Germany, the SED. Moscow's goal was clear: to turn Eastern Germany into a communist corridor that would expand Soviet influence into Western Europe. To finance the reconstruction of their own territory, devastated by the Nazi invasion between 1941 and 1944, the Soviets dismantled and shipped to the Soviet Union much of the industrial infrastructure in their area: factory machinery, locomotives, telecommunications equipment, scientific material. It was a form of in-kind reparation that impoverished East Germany for decades. In Berlin, the divided capital, each political candidate had to pass the scrutiny of the Allied Kommandatura. The result was an absurd filter. The four allies had to agree on each name. In the context of the growing tension of the Cold War, such an agreement became increasingly difficult to reach. Denazification died twice. The first slowly drowned out by its own internal contradictions. The second quickly executed by the logic of the Cold War. Already in 1947, the coalition that had defeated Nazism was falling apart. The tension between the Americans and the Soviets had begun much earlier, but it was with Winston Churchill's speech in Fulton, Missouri on March 5, 1946, where he spoke of an Iron Curtain dividing Europe from Stettin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic, when it became clear to all observers that the anti-Nazi alliance had been a tactical necessity, not a community of values. For Americans, communism began to displace Nazism as the #1 existential threat. And in this new scenario, Germany, or more precisely West Germany, ceased to be a problem to be solved and became an asset to be recruited. German loyalty to the Western Bloc was worth more than the ideological purity of the denazification process. The logic was simple and brutal. Nazis who were of no use to the Allies fell. Those who were useful survived, and sometimes they thrived. The most emblematic and documented case of this moral transaction was Operation Paperclip, the secret American program to recruit the best scientists in the Reich and bring them to the United States. The operation, which relocated more than 1,500 German and Austrian experts to American soil, was later valued at $10 billion in patents and industrial processes. Its best-known figure is Wernher von Braun, the scientist who had developed the V-2 rocket for the Nazi army, the first long-range ballistic weapon in history, which fell on London and Antwerp, killing thousands of civilians, and who, thanks to Paperclip, became the central architect of the American space program. It was his team that developed the Saturn V rockets that took Neil Armstrong to the moon in July 1969. The existence of substantial evidence that von Braun had used slave labor from concentration camps in his investigations at Peenemünde was carefully buried by the American military authorities. Paperclip's official policy stated that anyone who had been more than a nominal member of the Nazi Party could be recruited. In practice, as historian Annie Jacobson documented in her research, American military personnel systematically falsified or suppressed compromising information about the background of the scientists they wanted to incorporate. The Soviets did exactly the same thing with their own recruits. The practical result was that the most incompetent or least useful Nazis, those who had nothing to offer any of the competing great powers, were the ones most likely to fall under the punitive machinery of denazification, while the technicians, scientists, military strategists, and top-tier industrial managers found refuge under the umbrella of one superpower or another. In February 1948, the Soviets were the first to officially announce the end of their denazification procedures. It didn't take long for the others to arrive. On May 11, 1951, Germany's newly constituted federal parliament, the Bundestag, passed Law 131. It was a text of a few pages with enormous consequences. It allowed all those who had been dismissed under the categories of Mitläufer, follower, or minder belasteter, minor offender, in 1945 to return to their posts in the public administration. On October 6, 1952, a new decree formally reinstated the rights of all those who had been removed from public life because of their affiliations with the Nazi Party or the Wehrmacht. And from that point on, discrimination in employment or civil life based on those past affiliations was declared illegal. In other words, the German state that had emerged from the ruins of Nazism made it a crime to discriminate against ex-Nazis. The justification offered by Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, the first head of government of the Federal Republic, elected on September 15, 1949 by the Bundestag with a majority of exactly one vote, his own was pragmatic to the point of brutality. Fascism had so completely permeated the German political system and public service that there was no one left without a committed past to govern the country. "You don't throw away dirty water while you don't have clean water," he replied when asked about his personnel choices. The reality of the German administration of the 50s confirms what that phrase implies. By August 1950, a quarter of all department heads in the Central Federal Ministries were ex-members of the Nazi Party. In Bavaria, between 30 and 60% of the land's government officials were ex-Nazis at the time the federal state was founded in 1949. In Hesse that same year, 85% of the civil servants originally removed by the Denazifiers were back in their posts. The most representative and most disturbing case of the period was that of Hans Globke. This official had served in the Nazi Interior Ministry as one of the drafters of the legal commentaries on the Nuremberg laws of 1935, the racial laws that deprived German Jews of their citizenship and constituted the legal scaffolding of the Holocaust. Nazi Interior Minister Wilhelm Frick described him on April 25, 1938, as the most able and efficient official in my ministry when it came to drafting anti-Semitic legislation. After the war, Hans Globke became the State Secretary of the Federal Chancellery, the closest confidant to Chancellor Adenauer, the person who operationally passed the papers to the head of government. When in 1960 Adolf Eichmann was captured in Buenos Aires by the Mossad and taken to Jerusalem to be tried for his crimes as logistical coordinator of the Holocaust, the most terrified of the Bonn officials was not Adenauer, but Globke. He had helped build the legal framework in which Eichmann had operated, and there was the risk that Globke's name would fall in the Jerusalem judgment. Subsequent investigations revealed that the German Federal Intelligence Service, the BND, whose first director was Reinhard Gehlen, former head of the Wehrmacht's intelligence service on the Eastern Front, went so far as to recruit an informant from Eichmann's defense team to control what the defendant might say. Globke quietly retired with Adenauer in 1963 and received the Grand Cross of Merit of the Federal Republic. He died in Bonn in 1973. Adenauer was not naive about what he was doing. His policy was one of integration rather than purification, calculating that millions of Germans with committed pasts would be more inclined to support the new democracy if they felt they had a place in it. It was a political calculation that in terms of immediate stability worked, but it came at a quiet price. In Germany in the 1950s, what historians have called a communicative silence took hold. The economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder, the growing prosperity, the new refrigerators, the cars, the televisions, acted as a social anesthetic. Questions about the past were not asked, not at family tables, not in schools, not in parliaments. Parents did not tell their children what they had done or known during the Reich years, and the state, in silence, protected them. The crack in the wall of silence occurred in 1958 in a completely accidental way. A former member of one of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile death squads that operated in the East, executing Jews, Gypsies, and Soviet political commissars en masse during the German advance between 1941 and 1943, tried to enter the civil service in the state of Baden-Württemberg. Routine investigations of his job application uncovered his history, and that history led to other names, and those names led to more. The trial that followed, known as the Ulm trial, was the first mass murder case tried in West Germany since the founding of the federal state. The fact that 10 men responsible for the deaths of more than 5,000 people in the Baltic had been living perfectly ordinary and respectable lives in different corners of West Germany for more than a decade generated a shock that neither Adenauer's collective amnesia nor pragmatism could contain. As a direct result of the scandal, the Central Office of the Federal State Judicial Administrations for the Clarification of the Crimes of National Socialism was established in Ludwigsburg in 1958. Its mission to coordinate at the federal level the investigation and prosecution of Nazi crimes committed outside the ordinary German jurisdiction in the occupied territories, in the United States, extermination camps behind the front lines. It was the first systematic, centralized, and independent institution dedicated exclusively to that purpose. The historical irony that Frederick Taylor's own book points out precisely among the first members of the Ludwigsburg office, including its first director, Erwin Schuler, there were people who had belonged to the Nazi Party. Germany in 1958 had no choice but to use people who had been Nazis themselves to some degree to persecute the Nazis. From that moment on, the number of judicial proceedings increased considerably. The existence of the Ludwigsburg office also prompted the extension of the statute of limitations for Nazi crimes. In 1979, murder committed in a Nazi context was declared imprescriptible in Germany. The investigation and prosecution could continue until the culprits died. In total, between 1945 and 2004, West German courts convicted nearly 6,500 people for crimes linked to the Nazi regime, and indictments were opened against more than 100,000 defendants. The communicative silence of the 50s was not eternal. It had a generation limit. The children of those who had lived through the regime, born in the late 1930s and during the war, raised in post-war prosperity, educated at universities that were gradually opening up to outside influences, began to ask in the second half of the 1960s the questions that their parents had systematically avoided. What have you done? What did you know? Why did no one prevent it? Why is Hans Globke still in the Chancellery? Why was the Minister of Education a member of the Nazi Party? Why did the country's president, Heinrich Lübke, supervise the construction of facilities in Peenemünde, where concentration camp prisoners worked? The German student movement of 1968 was not, as in other countries, primarily a rebellion against the Vietnam War or against capitalist power structures, although all that was also present. It was, at its deepest core, a generational confrontation with Germany's specific past. The young people accused their parents of having silenced the Holocaust, of having buried it under the cement of the economic miracle, of having allowed the perpetrators to reintegrate peacefully into society. The clash was brutal and productive at the same time. Brutal because it opened family and social fractures that would take decades to heal. Productive because it created the culture of memory that Germany knows today. The Stolperstein, the bronze cobblestones that today commemorate the victims of Nazism on the sidewalks of their last known addresses in cities across Europe, the memorials of monumental dimensions such as the Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe in the heart of Berlin, inaugurated in 2005 a few meters from Hitler's former bunker, compulsory education about the Holocaust in German schools, the systematic investigation by the ministries and institutions of the state into their own past complicities. A survey conducted in 1995, 50 years after the end of the war, revealed that just over half of the German population viewed May 8, 1945, as a day of liberation, with an additional 28% seeing it as a day of liberation but also of defeat. Only 13% still considered it purely a defeat. It was a collective moral transformation of historic proportions, albeit belated and incomplete. So, how did Germany manage to get rid of the Nazis so quickly? The honest answer is that he didn't. What he did was something more complicated, less heroic, and more human. He executed the most notorious and least useful Nazis, He imprisoned a few thousand, he prosecuted several hundred thousand through a bureaucratic system full of holes that classified most as passive followers and charged them a fine. He overlooked those who had technical skills that the superpowers needed. He let Cold War logic bury the process before it could be completed. Adriano Sofri, the Italian politician who years later would reflect on the processes of collective memory in Europe, described the central problem precisely. When an entire society has participated in a crime, some as direct perpetrators, many more as passive accomplices, millions as indifferent spectators, the process of accountability has to be both universal and impossible. Universal because the responsibility is not limited to those who wielded the weapon. Impossible because you can't imprison 70 million people. The Allies failed to resolve this contradiction. No one could have done it completely. What they did do was create the minimum conditions: the destruction of the institutional apparatus of Nazism, the holding of the Nuremberg Trials as a legal and moral precedent, the eradication of the regime's most visible symbols, the mass distribution of documentation about the crimes, so that the transformation could begin. That this transformation took decades, that it went through phases of deliberate amnesia and painful generational confrontations, that it continues even today in the form of institutional research and educational initiatives, is part of what that story reveals. Formal denazification lasted approximately 7 years, from 1945 to 1952. Cultural denazification, if we can speak of a process that by definition never completely ends, has been going on for more than 8 decades and is still ongoing. In 1945, 42% of young Germans believed that the country needed a strong new leader. In 1952, 14% of Germans said they would vote for someone like Hitler. In 2024, the far-right AfD party won 24% of the vote in September's Bundestag elections, becoming the country's second-largest political force. The figures are not equivalent. The contexts are completely different. But the fact that the question of the limits of democracy and the durability of collective moral transformations has not lost its relevance is perhaps the most disturbing lesson that the history of denazification has to offer. The Nazis who escaped to Argentina are only the most cinematic part of this story. The part that should concern us most is the one that stayed, the one that was reinstated, the one that worked in the ministries and signed laws and educated her children in silence, the one that waited patiently for no one to ask her too many questions. That part never went away.